Part 2. The Valley of Death. Farewell music. Even your sweetest tunes are best kept silent. The Taliban on the edge of the village have stilled all lips. Chapter 9. Radio Mullah. I was 10 when the Taliban came to our valley. My Neba and I had been reading the Twilight books and longed to be vampires. It seemed to us that the Taliban arrived in the night just like vampires. They appeared in groups, armed with knives and Kalashnikovs, and first emerged in Upper Swat, in the hilly areas of Malta. They didn't call themselves Taliban to start with and didn't look like the Afghan Taliban we'd seen in pictures with their turbans and black-rimmed eyes. These were strange-looking men with long straggly hair and beards and camouflage vests over their shalwar kameez, which they wore with the trousers well above the ankle. They had jogging shoes or cheap plastic sandals on their feet, and sometimes stockings over their heads with holes for their eyes, and they blew their noses dirtily into the ends of their turbans. They wore black badges which said Shariat ya Shahadat, Sharia law or martyrdom, and sometimes black turbans, so people called them Torpaki or the Black Turban Brigade. They looked so dark and dirty that my father's friend described them as people deprived of baths and barbers. Their leader was Maulana Fazlullah, a 28-year-old who used to operate the pulley chair to cross the Swat River and whose right leg dragged because of childhood polio. He had studied in the madrasa of Maulana Sufi Muhammad, the founder of the TNSM, and married his daughter. When Sufi Muhammad was imprisoned in a roundup of militant leaders in 2002, Fazlullah had taken over the movement's leadership. It was shortly before the earthquake that Fazlullah had appeared in Imam Dari, a small village just a few miles outside Mingora on the other side of the Swat River, and set up his illegal radio station. In our valley we received most of our information from the radio because so many had no TV or are illiterate. Soon everyone seemed to be talking about the radio station. It became known as Mullah FM and Fazlullah as the Radio Mullah. It broadcast every night from 8 to 10 and again in the morning from 7 to 9. In the beginning Fazlullah was very wise. He introduced himself as an Islamic reformer and an interpreter of the Quran. My mother is very devout, and to start with she liked Fazlullah. He used his station to encourage people to adopt good habits and abandon practices he said were bad. He said men should keep their beards but give up smoking and using the tobacco they liked to chew. He said people should stop using heroin, and chars, which is our word for hashish. He told people the correct way to do their ablutions for prayers, which body part to wash first. He even told people how they should wash their private parts. Sometimes his voice was reasonable, like when adults are trying to persuade you to do something you don't want to, and sometimes it was scary and full of fire. Often he would weep as he spoke of his love for Islam. Usually he spoke for a while, then his deputy Shah Duran came on air, a man who used to sell snacks from a tricycle in the bazaar. They warned people to stop listening to music, watching movies and dancing. Sinful acts like these had caused the earthquake, Fazlullah thundered, and if people didn't stop they would again invite the wrath of God. Mullahs often misinterpret the Quran and Hadith when they teach them in our country as few people understand the original Arabic. Fazlullah exploited this ignorance. Is he right, Abba? I asked my father. I remembered how frightening the earthquake had been. No, Johnny, he replied. He is just fooling people. My father said the radio station was the talk of the staff room. By then our schools had about 70 teachers, around 40 men and 30 women. Some of the teachers were anti-Fazlullah but many supported him. People thought that he was a good interpreter of the Holy Quran and admired his charisma. They liked his talk of bringing back Islamic law as everyone was frustrated with the Pakistani justice system, which had replaced ours when we were merged into the country. Cases such as land disputes, common in our area, which used to be resolved quickly now took 10 years to come to court. Everyone wanted to see the back of the corrupt government officials sent into the valley. It was almost as if they thought Fazlullah would recreate our old princely state from the time of the Wali. Within 6 months people were getting rid of their TVs, DVDs and CDs. Fazlullah's men collected them into huge heaps on the streets and set them on fire, creating clouds of thick black smoke that reached high into the sky. Hundreds of CD and DVD shops closed voluntarily and their owners were paid compensation by the Taliban. My brothers and I were worried as we loved our TV, but my father reassured us that we were not getting rid of it. To be safe, we moved it into a cupboard and watched it with the volume low. The Taliban were known to listen at people's doors, then force their way in, take the TVs and smash them to pieces on the street. Fazlullah hated the Bollywood movies we so loved, which he denounced as un-Islamic. Only the radio was allowed, and all music except for Taliban songs was declared haram. One day my father went to visit a friend in hospital and found lots of patients listening to cassettes of Fazlullah's sermons. "You must meet Maulana Fazlullah," people told him. "He's a great scholar. He's actually a high school dropout whose real name isn't even Fazlullah," my father retorted, but they wouldn't listen. My father became depressed because people had begun to embrace Fazlullah's words and his religious romanticism. "It's ridiculous," my father would say, "that this so-called scholar is spreading ignorance." Fazlullah was particularly popular in remote areas where people remembered how TNSM volunteers had helped during the earthquake when the government was nowhere to be seen. On some mosques they set up speakers connected to radio so his broadcast could be heard by everyone in the village and in the fields. The most popular part of his show came every evening when he would read out people's names. He'd say, "Mr. So-and-so was smoking chars but has stopped because it's sinful," or, "Mr. X has kept his beard and I congratulate him," or, "Mr. Y voluntarily closed down his CD shop." He told them they would have their reward in the hereafter. People liked to hear their names on the radio, they also liked to hear which of their neighbors were sinful so they could gossip. "Have you heard about so-and-so?" Mullah FM made jokes about the army. Fazlullah denounced Pakistani government officials as infidels and said they were opposed to bringing in Sharia law. He said that if they did not implement it, his men would enforce it and tear them to pieces. One of his favorite subjects was the injustice of the feudal system of the Khans. Poor people were happy to see the Khans getting their comeuppance. They saw Fazlullah as a kind of Robin Hood and believed that when Fazlullah took over he would give the Khans land to the poor. Some of the Khans fled. My father was against Khanism, but he said the Taliban were worse. My father's friend Hidayatullah had become a government official in Peshawar and warned us, "This is how these militants work. They want to win the hearts and minds of the people, so they first see what the local problems are and target those responsible, and that way they get the support of the silent majority." That's what they did in Waziristan when they went after kidnappers and bandits. When they get power, they behave like the criminals they once hunted down. Fazlullah's broadcasts were often aimed at women. He must have known that many of our men were away from home, working in coal mines in the south or on building sites in the Gulf. Sometimes he would say, "Men, go outside now. I am talking to the women." Then he'd say, "Women are meant to fulfill their responsibilities in the home. Only in emergencies can they go outside, but then they must wear the veil." Sometimes his men would display the fancy clothes that they said they had taken from decadent women to shame them. My friends at school said their mothers listened to the radio Mullah, although our headmistress Madam Mariam told us not to. At home we only had my grandfather's old radio, which was broken, but my mother's friends all listened and told her what they heard. They praised Fazlullah and talked of his long hair, the way he rode a horse and behaved like the Prophet. Women would tell him their dreams and he would pray for them. My mother enjoyed these stories, but my father was horrified. I was confused by Fazlullah's words. In the Holy Quran it is not written that men should go outside and women should work all day in the home. In our Islamic studies class at school we used to write essays entitled How the Prophet Lived. We learned that the first wife of the Prophet was a businesswoman called Khadija. She was 15 years older than him, and she had been married before, yet he still married her. I also knew from watching my own mother that Pashtun women are very powerful and strong. Her mother, my grandmother, had looked after all 8 children alone after my grandfather had an accident and broke his pelvis and could not leave his bed for 8 years. A man goes out to work, he earns a wage, he comes back home, he eats, he sleeps. That's what he does. Our men think earning money and ordering around others is where power lies. They don't think power is in the hands of the woman who takes care of everyone all day long, and gives birth to their children. In our house, my mother managed everything because my father was so busy. It was my mother who would wake up early in the morning, iron our school clothes, make our breakfast, and teach us how to behave. It was my mother who would go to the market, shop for us, and cook. All those things she did. In the first year of the Taliban, I had 2 operations, one to take out my appendix and the other to remove my tonsils. Kushal had his appendix out too. It was my mother who took us to hospital. My father just visited us and brought ice cream. Yet my mother still believed it was written in the Quran that women should not go out and women should not talk to men other than relatives they cannot marry. My father would say to her, "Pikai, Purda is not only in the veil, Purda is in the heart." Lots of women were so moved by what Fazlullah said that they gave him gold and money, particularly in poor villages or households where the husbands were working abroad. Tables were set up for the women to hand over their wedding bangles and necklaces, and women queued up to do so or sent their sons. Some gave their life savings, believing that this would make God happy. He began building a vast red brick headquarters in Imam Dari, complete with a madrasa, a mosque, and walls and levees to protect it from the Swat River. No one knew where he got the cement and iron bars from, but the workforce was local. Every village had to take turns sending their men for a day to help build it. One day one of our Urdu teachers, Nawab Ali, told my father, "I won't be coming to school tomorrow." When my father asked why, he explained it was his village's turn to work on Fazlullah's buildings. "Your prime responsibility is to teach the students," replied my father. "No, I have to do this," said Nawab Ali. My father came home fuming. If people volunteered in the same way to construct schools or roads or even clear the river of plastic wrappers, by God, Pakistan would become a paradise within a year, he said. The only charity they know is to give to mosque and madrasa. A few weeks later, the same teacher told him that he could no longer teach girls as the Maulana doesn't like it. My father tried to change his mind. "I agree that female teachers should educate girls," he said. "But first we need to educate our girls so they can become teachers." One day Sufi Muhammad proclaimed from jail that there should be no education for women even at girls' madrasas. If someone can show any example in history where Islam allows a female madrasa, they can come and piss on my beard, he said. Then the radio mullah turned his attention to schools. He began speaking against school administrators and congratulating girls by name who left school. "Miss So-and-so has stopped going to school and will go to heaven," he'd say, or, "Miss X of Y village has stopped education at class 5. I congratulate her." Girls like me who still went to school he called buffaloes and sheep. My friends and I couldn't understand why it was so wrong. "Why don't they want girls to go to school?" I asked my father. "They are scared of the pen," he replied. Then another teacher at our school, a maths teacher with long hair, also refused to teach girls. My father fired him, but some other teachers were worried and sent a delegation to his office. "Sir, don't do this," they pleaded. "These are bad days. Let him stay and we will cover for him." Every day it seemed a new edict came. Fazlullah closed beauty parlors and banned shaving, so there was no work for barbers. My father, who only has a mustache, insisted he would not grow a beard for the Taliban. The Taliban told women not to go to the bazaar. I didn't mind not going to the China bazaar. I didn't enjoy shopping, unlike my mother, who liked beautiful clothes even though we didn't have much money. My mother always told me, "Hide your face, people are looking at you." I would reply, "It doesn't matter, I'm also looking at them," and she'd get so cross. My mother and her friends were upset about not being able to go shopping, particularly in the days before the Eid holidays, when we beautify ourselves and go to the stalls lit up by fairy lights that sell bangles and henna. All of that stopped. The women would not be attacked if they went to the markets, but the Taliban would shout at them and threaten them until they stayed at home. One Talib could intimidate a whole village. We children were cross too. Normally there are new film releases for the holidays, but Fazlullah had closed the DVD shops. Around this time my mother also got tired of Fazlullah, especially when he began to preach against education and insist that those who went to school would also go to hell. Next, Fazlullah began holding a shura, a kind of local court. People liked this as justice was speedy, unlike in Pakistani courts, where you could wait years and have to pay bribes to be heard. People began going to Fazlullah and his men to resolve grievances about anything from business matters to personal feuds. "I had a 30-year-old problem and it's been resolved in one go," one man told my father. The punishments decreed by Fazlullah's shura included public whippings, which we had never seen before. One of my father's friends told him he had seen 3 men publicly flogged after the shura had found them guilty of involvement in the abduction of 2 women. A stage was set up near Fazlullah's center, and after going to hear him give Friday prayers, hundreds of people gathered to watch the floggings, shouting Allahu Akbar. God is great. With each lash. Sometimes Fazlullah appeared galloping in on a black horse. His men stopped health workers giving polio drops, saying the vaccinations were an American plot to make Muslim women infertile so that the people of Swat would die out. "To cure a disease before its onset is not in accordance with Sharia law," said Fazlullah on the radio. "You will not find a single child to drink a drop of the vaccine anywhere in Swat." Fazlullah's men patrolled the streets looking for offenders against his decrees, just like the Taliban morality police we had heard about in Afghanistan. They set up volunteer traffic police called Falcon Commandos, who drove through the streets with machine guns mounted on top of their pickup trucks. Some people were happy. One day my father ran into his bank manager. "One good thing Fazlullah is doing is banning ladies and girls from going to the China Bazaar, which saves us men money," he said. Few spoke out. My father complained that most people were like our local barber, who one day grumbled to my father that he had only 80 rupees in his till, less than a tenth of what his takings used to be. Just the day before, the barber had told a journalist that the Taliban were good Muslims. After Mullah FM had been on air for about a year, Fazlullah became more aggressive. His brother Maulana Liaquat, along with 3 of Liaquat's sons, were among those killed in an American drone attack on the madrasa in Bajaur at the end of October 2006. 80 people were killed, including boys as young as 12, some of whom had come from Swat. We were all horrified by the attack and people swore revenge. 10 days later, a suicide bomber blew himself up in the army barracks at Dargai, on the way from Islamabad to Swat, and killed 42 Pakistani soldiers. At that time, suicide bombings were rare in Pakistan. There were 6 in total that year, and it was the biggest attack that had ever been carried out by Pakistani militants. At Eid we usually sacrifice animals like goats or sheep. But Fazlullah said, "On this Eid 2-legged animals will be sacrificed." We soon saw what he meant. His men began killing khans and political activists from secular and nationalist parties, especially the Awami National Party, ANP. In January 2007, a close friend of one of my father's friends was kidnapped in his village by 80 masked gunmen. His name was Malik Bakht Badar. He was from a wealthy Khan family and the local vice president of the ANP. His body was found dumped in his family's ancestral graveyard. His legs and arms had all been broken. It was the first targeted killing in Swat, and people said it was because he had helped the army find Taliban hideouts. The authorities turned a blind eye. Our provincial government was still made up of mullah parties who wouldn't criticize anyone who claimed to be fighting for Islam. At first we thought we were safe in Mingora, the biggest town in Swat. But Fazlullah's headquarters were just a few miles away, and even though the Taliban were not near our house, they were in the markets, in the streets and the hills. Danger began to creep closer. During Eid we went to our family village as usual. I was in my cousin's car, and as we drove through a river where the road had been washed away, we had to stop at a Taliban checkpoint. I was in the back with my mother. My cousin quickly gave us his music cassettes to hide in our purses. The Taliban were dressed in black and carried Kalashnikovs. They told us, "Sisters, you are bringing shame. You must wear burqas." When we arrived back at school after Eid, we saw a letter taped to the gate. "Sir, the school you are running is Western and infidel," it said. "You teach girls and have a uniform that is un-Islamic. Stop this or you will be in trouble and your children will weep and cry for you." It was signed, Fedayeen of Islam. My father decided to change the boy's uniform from shirt and trousers to shalwar kameez, baggy pajama-like trousers and a long shirt. Ours remained a royal blue shalwar kameez with a white dupatta, or headscarf, and we were advised to keep our heads covered coming in and out of school. His friend Hidayatullah told him to stand firm. Ziauddin, you have charisma, you can speak up and organize against them, he said. Life isn't just about taking in oxygen and giving out carbon dioxide. You can stay there accepting everything from the Taliban, or you can make a stand against them. My father told us what Hidayatullah had said. He then wrote a letter to the Daily Azadi, our local newspaper. To the Fedayeen of Islam, or Islamic sacrificers, this is not the right way to implement Islam, he wrote. Please don't harm my children because the God you believe in is the same God they pray to every day. You can take my life but please don't kill my school children. When my father saw the newspaper he was very unhappy. The letter had been buried on an inside page and the editor had published his name and the address of the school, which my father had not expected him to do. But lots of people called to congratulate him. You have put the first stone in standing water, they said. Now we will have the courage to speak.